If you want to see someone who doesn't know what they're doing not fix a motherboard, that's what this crap is. This is the original Intel 3rd generation motherboard, and it failed after about a year and a half. It's an ASrock H77 Pro4-M. The faults. This thing started freezing on startup and needed a reboot. This all happened the next day right after a Windows 10 update, so I started chasing software. But then it went into boot loops, then I knew it had a hardware problem. The usual thing is a power supply failing, i.e. not enough voltages. But a different power supply made no difference. Next I was thinking RAM, and when I removed the second stick here, it started working again. That only lasted a day, so I removed the third and fourth stick and it started working again. But that only lasted one reboot before the screen went blank. This was the first motherboard when I knew absolutely nothing, so I was thinking capacitors were failing. Coincidentally, this one also has 820 capacitors going out of value, like a second motherboard I'm working on. This is when I started touching capacitors to see if they were turning into resistors and getting hot. And when I touched the two that were here, they were getting warm. I was wondering if they were getting hot or if something was making them hot, and when I touched this MOSFET, it was burning. It was getting that hot that there must be a short somewhere. And that's when the board went totally dead. Oddly enough, when I unplugged this power connector, the fan would spin and the MOSFET wouldn't get hot. I removed 4 caps and the MOSFET and they were kind of okay. 3 caps are about 8% out of value, but that should be okay. The MOSFET comes up fine as an N channel. I got new ones anyway, but they show the same value as the one I took off the board. This is where I started watching repair videos and found out about the shorts on both sides of passives. And when I checked the MOSFET pad, it was reading a bit low. At the time I didn't know you could get schematics online, so I started probing anything in this area. And I found one over here. I pulled that off, and any semiconductor chips in the area that I thought would fail easily. But the low reading is still there. Now that I found the board viewer, if you hover over this pin, it says RSM reset. Maybe the reset is supposed to be low and gets pulled high by the standby power, but 20 ohms is a bit low. Update, I just got another failed ASrock H77 board and it's showing 17 ohms, which is good to know because the other brand boards I've got here are showing it very high. I'm now going to say my 18 ohms is normal. So now we're back to our overheating MOSFET, and it's 30 ohms on the source. Thinking I have a short, now's the problem of trying to find the part with the short. The problem is, if you probe any part on that 1.05 line, it's always going to show that 30 ohm, so you'll never know which part it is. And the easiest way to do it is inject that voltage into the line with a high current and see what gets hot. I don't have a high current power supply, so when I set it to 1.05 volts and short the wires, I get about 350 milliamps, meaning things aren't going to get very hot at 0.4 of a watt. I connect the power to the board, and with the 30 ohm in the board, I'm getting barely 100 milliamps. I turned the voltage up to 1.5 volts later and hoped it could handle it, and got about 140 milliamps. I felt all the parts in the area, but they were all cold. But when I felt the chipset, I could feel the chill leaving, and that's when I thought it was a blown chipset. Update, I checked the motherboard that I just got. This one's showing 20 ohms, and if it hasn't failed in the same manner, I guess 30 ohms is okay. On a side note, the other brands of motherboards are putting out about 55, 65 ohms on the 1.05 volt line. I'm now going to say my 30 ohm MOSFET is fine. Still not knowing what I'm doing, I'll show you all the dead ends and mistakes I made next. I saw a repair video where the BIOS chip wasn't getting any power. Wrongly assuming the battery powers it to keep its settings, I started chasing why there's no battery voltage on pin number 8. And this is the problem when you only have a board view. It only tells you what's connected to a net, not how the circuit works. And on top of that, if the circuit goes through a part, i.e. in series, i.e. parts not connected to ground on their other end, it changes net name, so you constantly have to click through parts to find out where the circuit's going. Update, if you click on a net, you can come up here and select net and it'll show you all the other nets it's connected to. For more tips on board viewer, go to this video on Learn Electronics Repair. I followed the battery voltage and it just goes to the chipset. Now that's when I realised I needed a schematic. I can't find a schematic for an ASrock, but I can find a schematic for an MSI. So I got something similar, a Z77. Looked at the BIOS and it says VCC 3 volt, not battery 3 volt. Basically the BIOS doesn't get power until it boots, so that was a big dead end and waste of time. Not really finding anything, this next mistake was a doozy. Remembering if I leave the auxiliary 12 volts unplugged, I do get fan spin when I start it, and that led to weeks of thinking something in this area that the auxiliary 12 volt is connected to is not letting the control chip to start. So I was blindly checking the whole area for shorts or breaks in the circuit. I was getting desperate now, so I injected 12 volts quarter amp into the 12 volt line and started tracing the lines, but I couldn't find anything. As a last resort, I was going to connect the auxiliary 12 volts, short the power supply and force the power into the board. And that's when I noticed the yellow 12 volt wires on the plug are on the wrong side and shorting straight to the ground. What a dope. Even though the 6-pin plug plugs into the 8-pin socket, the yellow 12-volt lines on the proper 4-pin plug are actually swapped. And that means I was shorting the power supply straight to ground and the power supply wasn't starting. Not being able to find anything, I just put everything back. And now it starts. It needs extensive testing, like a burn-in, but I don't know what put it into boot loops. All I did was change 3 caps here because they were about 8% out of tolerance. And I changed this MOSFET for a new one, even though the old one was fine. And the last thing I did was wash the board. I usually blow them down with a compressor and it's good enough, but this one had a sort of grime on it. You can get slight shorts with invisible contaminants that can only be removed with washing, so it might be that. I guess this is a video where I failed to fail.